Hello and welcome to a conversation with the Middle East Monitor. With you today is Nassim Ahmed and I will be your host. We are discussing a new book, Three Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew by Avi Shlaim. I'm really excited about today's conversation. So let me introduce our guest, the author, and get the conversation underway. Avi really doesn't need much by way of introduction. He is an Israeli-British historian, a professor of international relations at the University of Oxford, and fellow of the British Academy. He is one of Israel's new historians, a group of Israeli scholars who put forward critical interpretations of the history of Zionism and Israel. And of course, Avi is an author of countless books, including The Iron Wall, and War and Peace in the Middle East, A Concise History. I mean, he's got so many more other books, which I don't want to really get into. But this is his latest work. Welcome to the show, Avi, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be in the conversation with you, Nassim, and through you with the listeners of Middle East Monitor.
First of all, I mean, congratulations for having published this work. I really enjoyed reading your memoir. It's quite a unique blend of personal history as well as historical analysis. Would you say, though, it's your most important work?
No, I wouldn't say it's my most important work. If I had to choose my most important work from the 8 or so books that I've authored, I would say it's The Iron Wall, Israel and the Arab World, which was published in 2000, and I updated it in 2014. And the updated edition is 900 pages long. And it's a historical account of Israel's policy towards the Arab world from 1948 to when I wrote the update. It's a very detailed chronological account, and it's based on a lifetime of research, including research in the Israeli archives. So that book is the most detailed and the most analytical book that I have written about Israeli foreign policy. And it's a critical account as well, because as you mentioned in the introduction, I'm a new historian, so I challenge the Zionist narrative about the origins, the cause, and responsibility for the Arab-Israeli conflict. Three Worlds, Memoir of an Arab Jew, is not so important in the big scheme of things because it's a personal account. So it's a really important book for me to have written to try and make sense of my life. And it's an important record for my daughter and for my family, and for nephews and nieces, because it's a history of our family rather than just a conventional autobiography. So it's not a terribly important book, but inasmuch as it is of significance for the general reader, it's because of the reason that you mentioned, that I try to combine in his book the individual and the collective, the personal and the political. So roughly half the book is about me up to the age of 18, and the other half is about my family, more broadly about the Jewish community in Iraq, and more broadly about Iraqi history after the First World War. My wife read the book chapter by chapter as I was writing it, and when she got to chapter 5, she said, "I'm very worried, Avi. You got to chapter 5 and you are not born yet." And I said to her, that's the whole point. The book isn't just about me. It's about a lot of many other things.
I did get the feeling on reading your book that it is a book that you've been thinking of writing for a long time. There's a lot of questions there which had been burning in you for a number of years, and you wanted to answer those questions. We'll get to some of those questions later on. But I sense, you've been thinking about it for a long time. So what motivated you to want to embark on this project?
You're right. I thought about writing this book for a long, long time, and I hesitated. And a friend of mine, a historian, said to me, you must promise me you'll write this book. And he said, his name is Professor Shlaim. He's a historian. And he said to me that memoirs of politicians are usually very boring and predictable and self-serving. The only interesting memoirs are about a childhood when things happen. It's a formative period. And he gave me the example of Edward Said's book, Out of Place, which only goes up to the end of his university education. This is one of the best autobiographies that I've ever read. I continued to hesitate about writing a book about myself. I didn't know how to do it. I'd written about events, about the Arab-Israeli conflict, about the great powers in the Middle East. I even wrote a biography of King Hussein of Jordan, a full-scale political biography. But that was easy. There was one central character and everything revolved around him. But I didn't know how to write about myself, and I hesitated and hesitated until one day I read a book by a scholar, an Israeli scholar at Chicago University, Orit Bashkin. And she's an Ashkenazi, but she knows Arabic and she's a Middle East expert. And she wrote a wonderful book called New Babylonians, A History of the Jews in Modern Iraq. And I learned a huge amount from the book. It's very, very informative about all aspects of Jewish life in Iraq: economic, social, political, intellectual. And reading this book gave me the idea of writing about myself in this wider framework. So the book provided the framework into which I could try and fit myself and my family. So that's when I gathered the courage, mustered the courage to start writing this book. But it wasn't easy and it wasn't straightforward because I wrote an introduction and it was all over the place because I didn't know how the book will shape up. But once I started the chronology, the history of my father, then the history of my mother, then history of our family, and then when the move to Israel, my time in school in Israel, then the move to London, where I went to school from the age of 15 to 18. Once I embarked on the narrative, it was more straightforward. And when I'd finished the book, and when I'd finished the epilogue, I went back and I scrapped the original introduction and I rewrote it from scratch because I knew what the book was about.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I have to say, I mean, it reads really well. It doesn't look like an academic writing a book. It reads like a novel, and you have a fantastic way of writing. And the main characters are your parents. Both your parents are really amazing. Your father, in particular, I mean, his stoicness, his resoluteness, and the troubles he went to. I mean, when people read it, I think it really touches whoever reads the book, and I highly recommend people purchasing the book. But let's dive in and really start a conversation about the key themes and issues that you raise, and beginning with the title itself, Arab Jews, a memoir of Arab Jew. Some may have an issue with this hyphenated identity, Arab Jews, and think of it as being contradictory. We know the Israeli narrative is that this would be contradictory, and there are some within the Arab world who think it's a contradictory term. But why is it important for you? I mean, I'm reading your book, you challenge that, and you say Arab Jews, reviving the story of the Arab Jews is really important within the whole picture of Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East. Why is it important for you to revive and present the story of Arab Jews in the way you have? It's a very important story, and I really appreciated that. Why is it important to push back against those who say we shouldn't have that hyphenated identity?
So once again, I have a friend who was an inspiration, and her name is Ella Shoha, and she's an Iraqi Israeli, and she's a very eminent cultural critic and a professor at New York University. And she published a collection of essays called The Arab Jew, Palestine and Other Displacements. And I haven't thought very deeply about the notion of an Arab Jew, Sephardim, and Ashkenazim, social issues in Israel. My academic discipline is international relations. And international relations for me is kings and battles. I had a chronology and off I went. And I hadn't thought much about issues of identity. But reading Ella Shohat's essays made me think about and reflect about these issues of identity, issues of displacement, exile, colonialism, the colonial nature of Zionism. But for her, the pivotal concept is that of an Arab Jew. And I saw that it fitted my story as well. I'd never thought so about it before. And when I arrived in Israel, age 5, my identity as an Arab Jew was erased, deliberately erased by the education or indoctrination, Zionist indoctrination that I received. And in Israel, the term Arab Jew is very controversial. You can say I'm a French Jew or a Hungarian Jew or a Romanian Jew. Even I am a German Jew, despite the dark associations with the Holocaust. But if you say I'm an Arab Jew, they will jump at you and say, there is no such a thing. It's an ontological impossibility. It's a contradiction in terms. If you're a Jew, you can't be an Arab. And if you are an Arab, you cannot be a Jew. I beg to differ, because up to the age of 5, I lived in Baghdad. We were a Jewish family. We were an Iraqi family. We were Arab Jews. We spoke Arabic at home. Our culture was Arab culture. Our social customs were Arab customs. My parents' music was a very attractive blend of Jewish and Arab music. And we had much more in common linguistically and culturally with our fellow Iraqis, Muslims or Christians, than we had with our coreligionists from Eastern Europe. So I can think of no better term to describe my initial identity than that of an Arab Jew. It fits perfectly.
Yeah, Ella's book, it did win, I think, 3-4 years ago. It was the winner of the Palestine Book Awards. So we have hosted Ella during an event, Palestine Book Awards. I think maybe you were probably there. And as you described, the Arab Jews, especially in Iraq, they numbered nearly close to 200,000. They're the largest Arab Jewish community in the Middle East. And Baghdad, I think, at one time probably had more Jews than Arabs. And historically, I think you also mentioned it. I mean, there's an argument to even suggest that the civilization that was produced in the Middle East is very much Judeo-Islamic civilization. In many ways, you can make that argument as well if you so wished. And you describe the presence, Jewish presence in the Middle East is somewhat idyllic, you know. So give us a short version of that history of Iraqi Jews before the creation of Israel, or I should say before the rise of Arab nationalism, before Balfour imperialism, and which really started to create tension between the Arab Jews and the other Arab populations. So give us a sense of the short version of that history of Iraqi Jews up to the founding of Zionism.
So the Jews were in Iraq since the 6th century BC. They were there since the Babylonian exile. So we were not newcomers. We were certainly not intruders. We had been there longer than anyone else. Islam emerged in the 7th century, but we were already well established in Iraq. And also, Iraq was a center of Jewish civilization. It's where the Babylonian Talmud was compiled, where Jewish law was catalogued, and there were famous seminaries, yeshivas in Surah and Pumbedita. So Iraq was a center of Jewish civilization in the Near East long before the emergence of other centers of civilization, Jewish civilization in Europe. Then in the 20th century, during the First World War, Baghdad was often described as a Jewish city, also incidentally as a city of peace. But during the First World War, a third of the population of Baghdad was Jewish, and the shops and the banks and the markets closed on the Sabbath and on the Jewish holidays. Moreover, there were Jewish communities throughout the Arab world, in Egypt, in Syria, in Lebanon, but the Jewish community in Iraq was the most ancient, the most prosperous, the most successful, and the best integrated of all the Jewish communities. After the First World War, Faisal I became the king, and he had the job of forging all the different communities into one nation. And he embraced the Jews, and the Jews embraced him. And the 1920s were what was called by one scholar the Iraqi orientation in Jewish history. The Jews had an Iraqi orientation. They were focused on helping Faisal in the process of nation building, and they contributed to nation building at every level. The first finance minister, the famous finance minister, was Esqail Effendi, and the Jews contributed to the building of the economy, the financial system, the railway station, the transport system, customs, and excise. They played a prominent role in every aspect of Iraqi life and helped in the process of nation building. When did things go wrong? After the First World War, in the 1930s, and because of the rise of nationalism. both Arab nationalism on one side and Jewish nationalism or Zionism on the other side. In the 1930s, after the Nazis came to power in Germany, there was a lot of Nazi propaganda in Iraq, which turned some Iraqis against the Jews. There was the beginning of hostility towards the Jews that hadn't been there before. And parallel to that, there was the Zionist movement, which embarked on the systematic takeover of Palestine from the Balfour Declaration onwards. And Iraqis saw that the Zionists were displacing the Palestinian brothers. Some Palestinian refugees came to Iraq. So this was a combination of nationalism, conflicting nationalism, that made life unstable, uncomfortable. But there is one point that I really want to emphasize, and that is the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. Until then, the Jews were one minority among many. There are many other minorities, Assyrians, Circassians, Catholic Chaldeans, and the Jews did not stand out. They were one minority among many, and there was a tradition of give and take, of getting along. In contrast to Europe, where the Jews were the other, Europe had a Jewish problem. Iraq did not have a Jewish problem, but the creation of State of Israel changed all that, because for the first time in 2 millennia, Zionism gave the Jews a territorial aspect. There was a Jewish state, and it became easier for Arab nationalists to say to Jews, you don't belong here, you're an outsider. Yeah, go and join your brothers in Palestine. You're a Zionist. So whether they liked it or not, Iraqi Jews became identified with Zionism. Mm. And the end result of this process was that the Jewish community, which had been a major pillar of Iraqi society, was viewed increasingly as alien, as a fifth column, as a disruptive element that had to be gotten rid of.
Mm. You explained that really well. 2,500 years of uninterrupted Jewish history in the Middle East, in Iraq, and the rise of nationalism, forms of nationalism causes unrest. But at that time, Balfour announced his declaration of creating a Jewish homeland. At that time, was there any appetite within Iraqi Jews to create a state of Israel or to make Aliyah, to migrate to Israel? And what proportion of Iraqi Jews would you say were actually Zionists, and there was an appetite to actually want to leave Iraq and settle in Palestine?
I would say that at the time of the Balfour Declaration, 1917, the number of Iraqi Jews who supported the Zionist project was minuscule, really, really tiny. And I know this, and I've reported this in my book, that after the Balfour Declaration was issued in 1917, the British High Commissioner was, I forget his name now, but a delegation of Jews went to see him, prominent Jews, and they expressed the objection to the Balfour Declaration, because he represented Britain, which issued the Balfour Declaration, which provided for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. And it was a classic colonial document, because the Jews were 10% of the population, and the Arabs were 90%. And yet Britain awarded civil national rights to the Jews and only civil and religious rights to the Arabs. And the 90% were described in the Balfour Declaration offensively as the non-Jewish communities in Palestine. And the Iraqi Jews were opposed to the Balfour Declaration, and they pledged their loyalty to Iraq and to nation building in Iraq. And they said to the British High Commissioner, Palestine is a very poor country. Compared with Palestine, Mesopotamia is the Garden of Eden. We have everything here. Give us good government and we will really prosper and we'll contribute. So that was the attitude of the overwhelming majority of Iraqi Jews at that time. But I shouldn't ignore a tiny minority of religious Jews who did respond to the lure of Zion, but they were a tiny minority. I want to make one other point about the Balfour Declaration, which isn't important in the big scheme of things, but is very important to me personally. And that is that in the 10% Jews in Palestine, 58,000 Jews out of 600,000 people in Palestine in 1917, the 10% were about more than half were Eastern Jews. They were from the region. They were not European Jews who made Aliyah. They were Eastern Jews,
indigenous Palestinian Jews
from the region, and they spoke Arabic. And I wouldn't say that relations between Jews and Muslims were perfect in Palestine, but they had a common language and they got by. And the Sephardi Jews in Palestine were also opposed to the Balfour Declaration, and this is not widely known. And they objected to the Balfour Declaration. They wanted a national home for themselves and the Arabs in Palestine. They didn't want the British Empire to come and take over. And one last point on this, the mandate for Palestine was unique. The League of Nations awarded the mandate for Syria and for Lebanon to France, and it awarded the mandate for Iraq and Palestine to Britain. But all the other three mandates were for the mandatory power to prepare the country for self-government and then hand over power when the country could govern itself. The Palestine mandate was unique because the mandatory power was not because the Balfour Declaration was written by Britain into the terms of the League of Nations mandate. So as the mandatory power, Britain's obligation was not to prepare the local population for self-government, but to prepare the country for European Jews to come and take over the country. So the Palestine mandate was a terrible thing. And there is an Arabic saying that something that begins crooked remains crooked. And the Palestine mandate was crooked at the beginning, and it remained crooked until the very end. And it had only negative consequences for the Jews of Iraq.
Yeah, let's turn to the section of the book. You spend a lot of time on this, which has the issue which has received a lot of media attention, the question of why Iraq's Jews fled to Israel. You said that you have uncovered undeniable proof of Zionist involvement in the attacks that led to Iraqi Jews fleeing the country. You also say that there is no smoking gun, but as a historian, it is the most convincing conclusion based on best available evidence. So talk us through that. What is the proof? Of course, at that time, Israel had a small number of Jews, and the idea of ingathering Jews is something intrinsic within Zionism. And there was a desire to bring the Arab Jews from the Arab world, who were reluctant at the time, we should say, to leave their country of origin. So what was the scenario at the time, and what is the evidence that you cite to say that Zionism had played a role in the expulsion or the Iraqi Jews leaving their homeland?
Let's start with the facts. In 1950, there were 135,000 Jews in Iraq. By the end of 1952, 125,000 had ended up in Israel. And the question is, why did they leave? And the answer, the Zionist answer, is because of anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism was pervasive and endemic throughout the Arab world, including Iran. So there was persecution. That's why the Jews left. And my answer is more nuanced. I say that the Jewish exodus from Iraq was a complex phenomenon, and there isn't just one factor that explains it. And if I had to choose the main factor, I would say it was persecution of the Jews after the establishment of the State of Israel in Iraq, because the Iraqi army fought in Palestine, and Iraq was the only country which, at the end of the war, after the guns fell silent, all the neighboring Arab countries signed armistice agreements with Israel. The Iraqi army withdrew without signing an armistice agreement, so Iraq is still officially at war with Israel. And this created a backlash against the Jews in Iraq, both at the popular level and at the official level. This is the beginning of official persecution of the Jews in Iraq, dismissing Jews from government service, restricting the freedom of Jewish financiers and merchants, limiting the number of Jews who could go to university. This was the main driver of the exodus. But I add one other factor, which is that in 1950-51, 5 bombs exploded on Jewish targets in Baghdad. And there were always rumors when I was a boy. All my family and my relatives and all the Iraqis I knew were convinced that Israel had a hand in the bombs. And this fueled that Israel, in fact, forced them to leave a country, their homeland, that they were attached to and reluctant to leave, that Israel had a hand in organizing this exodus. And this fueled the resentment of the Israeli government. Whether right or wrong, that's what they believed, and they were resentful. I was always interested in this question. I wanted to get to the bottom of it. Was Israel involved? And in 1981-82, I spent a sabbatical in Jerusalem, and I spent the whole year in the Israel State Archives. And one day I ordered 2 files called Iraq 1950, and they were closed. And I said to the state archivist, more than 30 years have gone by, so why don't you release them? He said, I'll check. He came and he said to me, there are some Mossad documents in these files. And I said, fine, well, weed out the Mossad documents and leave the foreign policy files. He said, I'll check. The next day he came to me and he said, I can't do that. the whole files are closed. And I thought, aha, he's hiding something. And he said to me, I read the files from start to finish, and there isn't any incriminating evidence. So I had to suspend judgment. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm a historian, and I had no evidence that Israel was involved. Until a few years ago, when I was staying with my mother in Ramat Gan, and she had an elderly friend called Yaakov Karkukli. He was in his 90s, and he had been a Zionist activist. He had been in the underground, and he was a passionate Zionist, and he supported the Likud. So he had no motive to invent things that reflected badly on Israel. But he told me the story of what happened, of what he and his friends were doing, forging documents, organizing illegal and then legal immigration. And he told me that one of his colleagues, Yosef Basri, was responsible for 3 out of the 5 bombs. The famous bomb was in the Mas'ud Hashem Tov synagogue, in which 4 people were killed. So that wasn't him. Basri was responsible for 3 bombs, and his controller was a Mossad officer called Max Binet, who was based in Tehran in the days when Israel had covert relations with the Shah's Iran. So I said to him, this fits in with everything that I know, but your say-so isn't enough. I need a document. And one day he produced a document, which is a police report naming Basri and the evidence against him, and describing the interrogation and the results of the interrogation, and also naming his assistant who hid the weapons in synagogues and in private homes. So his assistant went with the police, and they rounded up all the weapons, which was quite a lot, and transmitters that were hidden in a synagogue. So now I have a police report, but it has its limitations because it's one plain page without a date, without a letterhead, without all the markers of an official document. And that's why I hesitated to call it a smoking gun. But I continued my investigations. I made contact with an Iraqi journalist called Shamil Abdelkadir, who had published a book in Arabic, not available in English, on the Zionist underground and the migration of the Jews from Iraq, 1950 to 1951. And in the book, he says that the first bomb was planted by a right-wing Iraqi activist from the Istiklal party, which was very anti-Jewish and wanted to expel all the Jews. So that was one bomb. And the famous bomb in the synagogue was a criminal who was put up to it, and it wasn't Basri. Basri was accused only of the 3 bombs for which there was evidence, and it was a proper trial. So my conclusion, and Abdul Qadir told me he has the full report of the police report of the interrogation. It's 258 pages, and the page that I have is not one page, but extracts from this report. He confirmed that it's an authentic report, so I didn't want to call it a smoking gun, but now I think I have undeniable evidence that Israel had a hand through the Zionist underground in the planting of the bombs in order to accelerate the Jewish exodus from Iraq. And my critics, my Zionist critics say that I attribute the exodus to the bombs, but I don't. I say it's a complex process. There are many factors, but this is one factor that needs to be taken into account, and it's always been denied.
Mm.
So,
and it's always been pushed on it to the realms of conspiracy, and that's always surprised me, because it's not like it's inconsistent with other activities that was taking place in the Middle East. If you look at the Laven affair, you mentioned that as well in Egypt, where there was a false flag, a terrorist act by an Israeli agent to stoke tension between the Brits and the Egyptians. This, no one contests that, but that led to also deterioration of relationship between Egyptian Jews and Egyptian Muslims, let's just say. So it's not like it's inconsistent. The Laven affair is no one doubts that this actually took place. So the idea that somehow in Iraq this is completely untrue, false in the realms of conspiracy, that's actually more unlikely than what you're presenting. So that's also another evidence which you cite, and I think people should be aware of. Okay, let's move on. I mean, we don't have much time. You moved to your family moved to Israel. You faced a lot of that's a shock, and it's quite a moving account of what your family go through, especially the account of your father, and it really touched me, as I mentioned at the beginning. So just tell us quickly about your initial experience and the experience of Arab Jews that moved to Israel. What was the reception and the hostility they faced there? And bearing in mind, as you said before, what starts crooked ends crooked. A lot of Arab Jews Iraqi Jews came to Israel, and in the back of their mind, they left their homeland and they resented Israel because they blamed Israel for the fact that they had left their country. So, what was the experience of Arab Jews that settled in Israel at the beginning?
I have a distant relative called Yitzhak Bar Moshe, who moved to Israel, and he wrote 10 books in Arabic, all in Arabic in Israel, and one of them is called Al-Khuruj min al-Iraq, Departure from Iraq. And he says, we left Iraq as Jews and we arrived in Israel as Iraqis. Oh. So that sums up the predicament.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a happy homecoming because there was a crisis and the Iraqi government allowed the Jews to leave legally, but on a one-way visa, and they could only take one suitcase and 50 dinars. And the only country they could go to is Israel, and Israel provided the transport. So it's not as if they had freedom. They ended up in Israel and penniless, and some of them felt trapped there. And when they arrived at the airport, they were sprayed with DDT, with investicide. And just try to imagine the shock of arriving at the promised land, and that's how you are greeted. In fairness to Israel, this was 1950-51, 2 years after the war, and Israel was really struggling, and it had immigration from Eastern Europe as well, so it wasn't easy. But the Jews of Iraq, over 125,000 of them ended up in Ma'abarot, in transit camps, where the conditions were very, very difficult, and gradually housing was found for them and jobs. But it was an extremely difficult period for them. And individual experiences varied, but for the community as a whole, the experience was like that of a tree being pulled up by the roots. It was very traumatic, a collective trauma for Iraqi Jews. My family, we didn't suffer so much. We were privileged because we were very wealthy, and my mother had a British passport. My sisters and I and her mother left Baghdad on her British passport to Cyprus. Then we arrived in Israel. We didn't go through this process. But I remember as a boy feeling really inferior. I didn't encounter discrimination. No one said to me, "You are an Iraqi, you are inferior." But it was in the air that everything Arab, the Arabs were the enemy. Arabic was the language of the enemy. Arabic was considered an ugly, guttural, primitive language. And I was embarrassed to speak Arabic to my father, who couldn't speak Hebrew, in front of my friends. So these were the values of this new society, European values, and I internalized them, and I had a sense of inferiority which defined my relationship with Israeli society. And it's not until I had left Israel and studied in England, went to university in England, that I got over this paralyzing, debilitating sense of inferiority.
Yeah, you speak about that really powerfully, the alienation that you felt in Israel, and you even dabbled in extremism, you mentioned. So would you say the third leg of your journey, coming to the UK, is what rescued you from the temptation of Jewish Zionist extremism, Jewish extremism, which had become increasingly appealing to you? Would you say that's what saved you coming to the UK?
Coming to the UK made a very big difference. Ella Shohat has this phrase, changing linguistic landscapes and the emotional cartography of displacement. It's rather, I'll repeat it, changing linguistic landscapes and the emotional cartography of displacement. But it describes my life up to the age of 15. At the age of 5, there was a change, not just of a society, a country, a culture, but I had to learn a new language when arriving in Israel. At the age of 15, there was a second exile. When I went to England, I didn't know English. I had to learn a new language and adjust to a new society. So it was a formative experience to live in England and to go to a Jewish school where being an Israeli carried a lot of kudos, although I never felt a genuine, fully fledged Israeli because I was an Israeli of the inferior kind. Still, I was treated with great respect at school, at the Jewish Free School in London. But what had changed is my sense of identity. In Iraq, I was a Mizrahi, an Oriental Jew, a Jew from an Arab country, and my Iraqi identity was erased, and a new identity was given to me as an Israeli. But I was resentful of the labor establishment. That's why I flirted with right-wing ideologies, with the Herut party, which was headed by Menachem Begin. He was a spellbinding orator. What did you have to offer someone like me? The attacks on the labor establishment, which was distant and arrogant. And Begin said to us, we're equal. You are my brothers. We are all Israelis. So he played on our sense of discrimination and injustice. That's why I was flirting with right-wing ideologies. But when I got to England, especially when I went to university in England, I could see Israel with greater detachment, and the process of my disenchantment with Israel began when I was a history student at Cambridge after the 6-Day War. I had served in the IDF in the mid-1960s, and I served proudly and loyally because in my time, the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, was true to its name. But after the Six-Day War, Israel became a colonial empire, and the IDF became the brutal police force of a brutal colonial empire. And that's where the beginning of the parting of the ways between Israel and myself. And I like to say that I didn't abandon my country abandoned me. I remained true to the humanistic and egalitarian values that I developed in Britain, whereas Israel, especially in the last 20 or so years, had been moving steadily to the right.
Avi, it's been amazing talking to you. It's amazing pleasure. Really, thank you for joining us. And I want to thank our guests watching, viewers joining at home. Buy the book. It's an amazing book, 3 Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew. It's a riveting read, actually, and highly recommended. Thank you all very much. And I'll see you again in another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Nazim, for this conversation. Goodbye.